Dominatrix is someone who acts out scenarios with her clients that they are erotically fixated on, and they typically incorporate the dominatrix embodying a kind of iconic, powerful female role. So I did a lot of playing teacher, nurse, mommy, cheerleader, customs officer, and there is an element of physical abuse, but it's really more of an acting job, and I would say it's more accurate to compare my job to maybe that of a therapist or a social worker as much as it is a prostitute or a stripper. The work of a dominatrix is largely enacting these role play scenarios where a lot of the time you're reenacting sort of moments of profound disempowerment of your clients, and a lot of that comes from childhood trauma or different kinds of abuse, and so it can be very intense. And I think that as I grew up in that job, I was there for 4 years, and towards the end of it, I just was a little bit more awake in my own emotional life and really awake to sort of the intimacy of that experience, and it became pretty uncomfortable. And regardless of the fact that it wasn't my fantasy and that I didn't get turned on by it per se, it still started to feel like a betrayal of my own sexuality and my own intimacy, and I started to see how it limited my own personal relationships. My book covers the 4 years that I worked as a professional dominatrix. And you know, it's about a sensational topic, but I also think that there's a really powerful element of universality to it, because it's not really about working as a dominatrix or the S&M world. There's a lot of juicy details about that in it, but really it's a story of personal transformation and about getting more honest with myself and coming to a place of greater self-acceptance. And I think most people can relate to that. After a few years in the business, I started doing a little bit of freelance work on the side because the money was much better and I got to pick and choose my clients. And I remember a particular scene, and this has been written about in the press before, but I had a private client and he was into doing sort of public exhibitionism sort of scenes, and so I remember walking around Manhattan with him in sort of a compromised position. There was some rope involved and it was night, but we were in the meatpacking district of Manhattan, and you know, I just remember having a moment sort of clarity and thinking, what am I doing here? You know, this isn't me. You know, I started thinking about my mother and the people who loved me, and it just started to feel like I was compromising something I didn't really feel willing to compromise anymore. I regret nothing about my experience, which is not to say that there aren't things that I think back on with embarrassment or a certain amount of apology, but I'm not ashamed of anything that I did, and ultimately I think because I was able to get really honest with myself, particularly in the writing process, in the end it ultimately made me a braver, kinder, more accepting and open-minded person. I get emails all the time from young women who have read about me or read the book and who are interested in getting a foot in the door of the commercial S&M industry, and while I don't think it's a terrible fate to befall a young woman, I've never felt comfortable introducing someone to that world, and at this point in my life I think I would have a hard time explaining it to a child of mine. And I think that my experience is different from people who live it as a lifestyle, but for me, as someone who worked in the sex industry and did it for commercial reasons, I just wouldn't feel comfortable, I wouldn't feel proud of describing that to a young person that I loved. I think that this is the kind of thing where if someone is really meant to and driven to find their way into that world, they'll find their way into that world, and a lot of them will then find their way out of that world, but I don't consider it my responsibility or right to lead anyone into that world.